deco moje draženici, deco moja draženici. Danče zove kruna ište, dajdemo na bojište, dajdemo.
This is the story of the Serbian Chetniks, one of the three main Yugoslavian groups that fought for control of Yugoslavia during the Axis invasion of World War II. The Chetniks ultimately failed in large part because they couldn't, like a Hollywood movie star, stay in a stable relationship with any of the partners they tried to ally themselves with. The story I'm about to tell is complicated, even for me, and I've been studying this topic for months, but I will try to make it clear to you, so sit back, ignore the terrible Winston Churchill impersonations, grab some snacks, and enjoy. And speaking of snacks to enjoy while learning a little history, here's a word from our sponsors, Chicha Matcha, makers of delicious candy for the whole family.
Puno lešnika I fino mlečnog krema, sa njom doručak se uvek lakše sprema. Još da dodamo da ukusna je jako, cica macu traži svako. Cica maca! Cica maca je pionir, iskreni prijatelji vaše porodice.
The story of Yugoslavia is a fascinating and complicated one. It was a country that was cobbled together after the end of World War I and originally called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. From the outset, the country was controlled by the mainly Catholic Croats and the mainly Serbian Orthodox Serbs, two nationalities that share a common language, although they use a different alphabet, but have always looked at each other over a wide religious and cultural divide. Although they share a common border, their coexistence has not always been an easy one. These differences between the Serbians and Croats would blow up during World War II, and then again in the 1990s during the Yugoslav Wars. And although I won't focus on religion in Yugoslavia, that must be mentioned, as it was, and to some extent still is, a big deal. Along with Catholics and Orthodox Christians, a substantial percentage of Yugoslavia's population was Muslim, and none of the three religious groups were inclined to get along. In fact, there are many atrocities, and I mean atrocities, committed by each religious group against each other. But let's get back to the story at hand, the rise and fall of the Chetniks, and their problems playing well with others. In April of 1941, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was invaded by the Nazis, Italians, and Hungarians, following after only 11 days of heavy bombing and fighting. The Royal Yugoslavian Army was routed, and almost half of their forces were taken prisoner by the invaders. Three puppet governments were formed: Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro, with the rest of the country being divided among Hungary, Italy, and Bulgaria. Of the puppet governments, the two strongest, by far, were those in Croatia and Serbia. The independent state of Croatia was a German puppet state controlled by the Ustasi, an ultra-Catholic, fascist, nationalist, terrorist, racist, that's a lot of ists, organization that the Germans chose to run it. Serbia, similar to Croatia, was also a puppet state installed by the Germans, who inserted Milan Nedic, an ex-Yugoslavian army general, as a puppet prime minister of the German-controlled government. The ideology of this government was pretty simple: obey the Nazis and survive. Of course, there were the old Serbian prejudices. We are better than everyone else. But, mainly the government put aside nationalism in return for living under fascism. But more important than the puppet governments formed by Germany and Italy, or the parts of Yugoslavia controlled by Hungary and Bulgaria, three organizations emerged to fight for the control of Yugoslavia and its future: the Ustasi, as I just mentioned, the Chetniks, and the Partisans. The Ustasi were led by Ante Pavelic, an ultra-Catholic, fascist, Croatian nationalist to his bones, whose one driving ambition was to create a greater Croatia, and along the way kill as many Serbians, Jews, Roma, and any others the Ustasi deemed to be racially inferior. Boy, he sounds like a nice guy. Given their thoughts on racial purity and inferiority, it is no surprise that the Ustasi were closely aligned with the Nazis and did not fight to remove them from Yugoslavia. The Partisans were led by Josip Broz Tito, a charismatic Croatian communist who took as many weapons as he could, and some, but not all of his ideology from Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Tito and the Partisans wanted one thing: a united, communist Yugoslavia. And finally, the Chetniks, a Serbian nationalist group dedicated to reinstalling King Peter II on the throne of a unified Yugoslavia. The Chetniks were led by Draza Mihailovic, a staunch anti-fascist, anti-communist, royalist, pro-Serbian nationalist, here we go with the ists again, an ex-Yugoslav general who fought briefly against the Nazis. Just because nothing was simple in Yugoslavia during World War II, there were several groups of Serbians fighting as Chetniks, but the most powerful by far, and the one recognized by the Allies, was that led by Mr. Mihailovich. So now that we know a little about Yugoslavia at the beginning of World War II, let's look more closely into how Mihailovich sought to enter into alliances that would enable the Chetniks to push aside the partisans and the Ustasi in order to realize the Chetnik dream of reinstating King Peter to rule over a united, pro-Serbian Yugoslavia. This gets a little confusing, so stay with me. In what is a prime example of opportunism and the term politics makes strange bedfellows, Mihailovich, the staunch anti-communist, who ultimately planned to use his guns against the Nazis and partisans, quickly turned to the communist partisans as potential partners to fight the fascists. King Peter's government in exile in London, thinking that the only way to get rid of the Nazis was to have a united partisan and Chetnik front, urged this union. But the Chetniks and the partisans could not reach a deal, and talks quickly took a turn for the worse, with both sides walking away. Given that Mihailovich and the Chetniks were fiercely anti-communist, and Tito and the partisans were fiercely anti-royalist, should this have come as a surprise to anyone? But at approximately the same time that Mihailovich and the Chetniks were watching their relationship with the partisans go nowhere, they were also negotiating with the Nazi puppet state of Serbia, promising to help the Nazis wipe out the partisans. You got that? For a brief time, the Nazis gave the Chetniks arms and supplies to fight against the communist partisans, but the Nazis ultimately, and mistakenly, came to the conclusion that the Chetniks were actually leading the resistance against them, and turned their fury against the Chetniks, who took the blame for the resistance that was in fact being led by Tito and his partisans. Mihailovich and his Chetniks retreated to Bosnia and Croatia, hoping to fight another day, hopefully with another ally. As the first part of a famous saying goes, heaven has no rage like a love turned to hatred. So after being jilted by Tito, Mihailovich and the Chetniks quickly decided that the partisans were their greatest enemy, and so started a dirty, bloody war between the partisans and Chetniks that never really let up until the end of World War II. One steady relationship the Chetniks maintained was with the Italians, at least until the Italians surrendered in September of 1943 and threw in with the Allies. The reasons were pretty simple. The Chetniks were running out of friends, and therefore supplies and weapons. They also needed protection from the Serb-hating Ustasi. So in return for helping the Italians fighting the partisans, the Chetniks received supplies and protection. This relationship with fascist Italy was not looked at kindly by the British, and we will talk about them in a minute, and was one of the reasons why the British ultimately backed the partisans rather than the Chetniks. And speaking of those Serb-hating Croats that were represented by the Ustasi, and once again, because this is Yugoslavia, small detachments of Chetniks also cut deals with the Ustasi to jointly fight against, you guessed it, the partisans. It is important to note that the main force of Chetniks kept on doing what came natural to them, hating and fighting the Ustasi and the Croats, and that these deals were not approved by Mihailovich. And just to make things more interesting, at the same time the Chetniks were talking to the Nazis and the partisans, they were also talking with the British and trying to get aid from them. And of course, because nothing was simple in Yugoslavia, the British were also talking with the Chetniks' arch-enemy, the partisans. I'm going to spend a little more time on the British because it is interesting, and more importantly, if the British had ultimately chosen to fully support the Chetniks, things might have turned out a lot differently for them, for Mihailovich, and for Yugoslavia. The British, who were fighting in both Europe and Asia, and were very overextended, pretty much only cared about one thing when entering into alliances: who could kill the most Nazis. So when it came to Yugoslavia, Churchill had a decision to make. Do we back the Chetniks or the partisans? Winston Churchill was a fierce anti-communist, and although he went to great lengths to work with, and please, Stalin and the Soviet Union to keep them fighting the Nazis, he had grave misgivings about what a post-war would look like with a victorious Soviet Union. So just as he held his nose and worked with Stalin, Churchill knew that if the partisans would further the Allies' aims in Yugoslavia better than the Chetniks, he would have to throw his support behind Tito. But the British gave Mihailovich and the Chetniks plenty of time and opportunities to prove themselves, and actually recognized and backed Mihailovich and the Chetniks as the official resistance to the Axis in Yugoslavia, until they officially backed the partisans in the summer of 1944. But back to the story of how they got there. Churchill instructed Fitzroy MacLean, the British Army officer tasked with finding the best ally in Yugoslavia, simply to find who was killing the most Germans and suggest the means by which they could help them kill more. The British suspected that the Chetniks were collaborating with the Nazis and the Italians, which, as I mentioned before, they were. The British also correctly identified that the Chetniks were not as effective as killing Nazis as the partisans, in large part because the Chetniks devoted a lot of troops and weapons to fighting against the partisans, as well as fighting a bloody, dirty war against the Croats, and the Bosnian Muslims, which included horrible massacres. The Chetniks justified their brutal treatment of the Croats and Muslims as retaliation for attacks on them, and ultimately it was hard to sort out the good guys from the bad guys here. When McLean pointed out to Churchill his concerns about backing the partisan communists, Churchill replied, "Do you intend to make Yugoslavia your home after the war?" When McLean answered, "No, sir," Churchill replied, "Neither do I." Churchill went on to say, "It was common ground that the Chetniks, though in the main well disposed towards Great Britain, were militarily less effective with the communist partisans, and that some of Mihailovich's subordinates had undoubtedly reached accommodation with the enemy." So Churchill chose Tito and the partisans, and once again, the Chetniks were left out in the cold. It should be noted, not surprisingly, after the war, Churchill regretted making his decision, and some scholars thought that Churchill had been played by Tito. Given the constant ups and downs between the Chetniks and the revolving door of allies, the Chetniks had to improvise when it came to weapons, which enabled them to continue the fight against whoever they were fighting against at the time: the partisans, Croats, Muslims, and the Nazis. There are 4 known surviving examples of the improvised weaponry in a museum in Belgrade. The first being a Yugoslavian M24 with a custom pistol grip and a shark fin-esque foregrip, an extended magazine, and a stock salvaged from possibly either Soviet PPS-43 or Nazi MP40, who knows anymore. The combination of an underfolding stock and a cut-down barrel allows the soldier greater movement and concealability compared to the Yugoslav M24 and its original rifle configuration. Next is the quote-unquote Koran submachine gun. This is possibly a Beretta MP-3844 merged with Grandpa's Yugoslav M24 or hunting rifle, as the gun itself appears to be taken from a Beretta MP-3844, but the sights and stock appear to be from a sporting or hunting rifle. Another submachine gun, the Mihailovic Ribasavina, appears to be completely made in a Chetnik's garage, as the stock doesn't seem to match any other submachine gun of that period. The rest of it seems too poorly manufactured to be the product of any respectable arms factory. Finally, the Mihailovic Ribasavina stun gun. This submachine gun appears to be a homemade copy of the British stun gun. It is entirely possible that the Chetniks would have access to stun guns, as the British did send some arms shipments to them. The barrel jacket with holes and the sideways magazine well are signs that this weapon was inspired by the stun gun. Stun guns were also very cheap to produce, only costing about $11, because they are made of primarily sheet metal. This meant that the Chetniks could theoretically reproduce them given their limited resources. As the war in Europe started to wind down in late 1944, the Chetniks made one last-ditch effort to gain a new partner: the Soviet Union. Maybe the Chetniks thought that their shared Slavic heritage, and use of the Cyrillic alphabet, was enough to bring the two together. But the Soviets must have thought that the Chetniks' overtures to them to be somewhat odd. If the Chetniks were asking them to turn against the communist partisans, they were clearly going to rule over the post-war Yugoslavia, given that the Allies were now fully backing them. Predictably, the Soviets told the Chetniks to join forces with the hated partisans, and predictably, the Chetniks declined. Mihailovic, still needing to fight the partisans, staged one final push in early 1945, but what was left of his forces was routed by the partisans, who, by now, were fighting alongside the Ustasi. Mihailovic managed to avoid capture by Tito's communist government of Yugoslavia for over a year, but was finally captured in March of 1946, put on trial in June, and unsurprisingly, executed in July. During the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, there are many Serbian paramilitary groups that modeled themselves after the Chetniks of World War II. Units who donned the same wool cap and large beard as their forefathers and inherited their fierce Serbian nationalism. For instance, SRS, or the Serbian Radical Party, a far-right, ultra-nationalist organization, had their own Chetnik military detachment. The SDG, or the Serbian Volunteer Guard, also had their own Chetnik military wing that consisted of 1,000 to 1,500 men. The Serbian National Renewal, also known as the Avengers or White Eagles, were very similar to the Chetniks as well. A lot has happened to the pro-Serbian Chetnik cause since Draza Mihailovic was executed in 1946, thus ending the formal Chetnik movement for all intents and purposes. Tito was able to keep Yugoslavia together through his force of will until his death in 1980. But within 10 years of Tito's death, Yugoslavia started to unravel, and the traditional intra-ethnic rivalries and hatreds re-emerged, bringing to the surface some of the same passions and hatreds evident in World War II. Yugoslavia now consists of 7 independent nations who all coexist mostly peacefully. Let's hope that it stays that way.